pregnant and abandoned. A millionaire found an abandoned baby outside his villa doorstep. What's the point of all this? He muttered to himself, running a hand through his graying hair. Night fell on the city, and the lights of the mansion turned on automatically, illuminating empty spaces and lifeless rooms. Alexander headed to his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the amber liquid reflecting the dim light. He sat in his leather chair, looking out the window at the city below him. From here, he could see his company building, a skyscraper that dominated the skyline, symbol of his success, his wealth, and his loneliness. Just another day, he sighed, closing his eyes. Another empty day. The silence was so profound that I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, each second marking the passing of a life that, for all its opulence, had no real meaning. Alexander stood up, walking towards a shelf full of framed photos. Smiling faces looked back at him. Business associates, celebrities, politicians. But not a single family photo, not a single face that really mattered to him. Is this all I am? He wondered aloud, his voice cracking slightly. A man surrounded by wealth, but with no one to share it with? He approached the window, resting his forehead against the cold glass. The city glowed beneath him, full of life and possibility. And yet, here he was, at the top of his ivory tower, more alone than ever. There has to be something more, he whispered, his breath fogging the glass. There has to be a purpose, a reason. Little did Alexander know that his life was about to change drastically. In the darkness of the night, fate was approaching his door, bringing with it an unexpected turn that would shake the foundations of his lonely existence. The rain beat heavily against the windows of the mansion, as if the sky itself shared Alexander's melancholy. The millionaire was preparing to retire to his room when an unexpected sound broke the monotonous rhythm of the storm. "What was that?" he murmured, straining his ears. The sound was repeated, a weak cry, almost drowned out by the roar of the rain. Alexander felt his heart race. Without thinking twice, he headed towards the front door. With trembling hands, he opened the heavy oak door. The cold wind and rain hit him in the face, but that didn't matter. His eyes locked on a small bundle wrapped in soaked blankets, left on the threshold of his house. "Oh my God," she whispered, bending down to pick up the baby. The little boy was crying weakly, his little face wrinkled with cold and fear. Alexander held him to his chest, feeling a surge of emotions he had never experienced before. "Shoo, easy, little one," he murmured, his voice shaking. "You're safe now." He quickly entered the house, closing the door behind him. With the baby in her arms, she headed to the living room, her mind a whirlwind of questions and emotions. "Who left you here?" he asked quietly, looking at the baby who was now calming in his arms. "Why me?" Alexander sat on the couch, holding the little boy with a tenderness he didn't know he possessed. For the first time in years, he felt his heart fill with something other than emptiness and loneliness. "Don't be afraid," he whispered, gently caressing the baby's cheek. "I will protect you." In that moment, looking into the little boy's innocent eyes, Alexander knew that his life would never be the same. A protective instinct, fierce and unexpected, took hold of him. "What am I going to do?" he asked himself, his voice barely audible. But deep in his heart, he already knew the answer. He couldn't abandon this helpless creature, not when fate had put her in his path. The rain continued to fall outside, but inside the mansion, a heat that Alexander thought was lost forever began to grow. With every second she spent holding the baby, she felt like a new door was opening in her life, a door to a future full of challenges, but also love and purpose. Together, he murmured, looking at the baby who was now sleeping peacefully in his arms. "We will face this together." And so, in the middle of the stormy night, a new story began. A story of redemption, unexpected love, and second chances. Alexander didn't know it yet, but this little being that destiny had placed in his hands was about to change his world forever. The next morning came with a mix of confusion and determination for Alexander. As the sun filtered through the mansion's windows, he was already awake, holding the baby carefully as he dialed a number on his phone. "Dr. Ramirez," "I need your help urgently," Alexander said, his voice strained. "It's complicated. Can you come to the mansion as soon as possible?" Minutes later, Alexander's trusted doctor delicately examined the baby. The millionaire watched, his heart pounding, afraid of what he might discover. "Alexander," Dr. Ramirez said, his tone serious, "there's something you should know. This baby is a girl, and she's pregnant." The shock hit Alexander like a bolt of lightning. "What? But how is it possible? She's just a girl." "He is approximately 13 years old," the doctor explained, his voice filled with compassion. "She is in the second trimester of pregnancy." Alexander sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the revelation. My God, who would do something like that to a little girl? While the doctor continued his examination, Alexander could not take his eyes off the young woman. His mind was a whirlwind of questions and mixed emotions. "We need to investigate this," Alexander muttered, his determination growing. "Someone has to answer for this." In the days that followed, Alexander immersed himself in frantic research. He hired the best private detectives, used all his contacts. Every clue, every detail, took him deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and lies. One night, while reviewing some documents in his study, Alexander found himself looking at an old photograph. His heart stopped for a moment. "It can't be," he whispered, bringing the image closer to his eyes. In the photo, a young woman smiled at the camera. Her eyes, identical to those of the girl who was now sleeping in the next room. "Maria," Alexander murmured, a name he had not uttered in years. A name that belonged to his past, to a life he thought he had left behind. With trembling hands, Alexander searched for more information. Each discovery brought him closer to a truth he was afraid to face. "What have I done?" he asked himself, his voice breaking in the solitude of his study. "How could I not know?" Guilt and remorse washed over him like a wave. Alexander realized that the abandonment of this girl was not a random act of fate. It was the result of decisions made years ago, of buried secrets that were now coming to light. "I failed you," he whispered, looking towards the room where the young woman rested. "I failed you both. But I swear I will do the right thing now." With new resolve in his eyes, Alexander stood up. "I knew the road ahead would be difficult, full of dangers and painful truths. But he was determined to face it, to redeem himself, and to protect this girl and her unborn baby, no matter the cost." The night progressed, and with it, the certainty that nothing would be the same again. Alexander Ramos, the reclusive millionaire, was preparing for the most important battle of his life. A fight for truth, redemption, and the love he never knew he could feel. The days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself torn between two worlds. The frenetic pace of his business and the growing responsibility of caring for the pregnant young woman. Every morning, before diving into the chaos of meetings and calls, he passed by the girl's room. "Good morning, little one," he whispered, his voice soft and heavy with emotion. "How are you feeling today?" The young woman, whom he had begun to call Lucia, looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "Better, Mr. Alexander. Thank you for everything." Those words, so simple, resonated in his heart throughout the day. In the midst of million-dollar negotiations and corporate decisions, Alexander found himself thinking about baby formula and how to adapt his mansion for a newborn. One afternoon, in the middle of an important video conference, his phone vibrated. It was a message from the nurse he had hired to take care of Lucia. "The girl is having contractions. It looks like the baby is on the way." Alexander's world stopped. Without thinking twice, he stood up from his chair, interrupting the meeting. "I'm sorry, gentlemen. I have a family emergency," he announced, leaving everyone stunned. As he frantically drove to the hospital, his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. "Family?" he asked himself. "When did I start thinking of them as my family?" In the hospital waiting room, Alexander paced back and forth, his heart pounding. Every scream he heard from the delivery room made him shudder. "Mr. Ramos," a nurse called. "It can happen now." With trembling steps, he entered the room. There was Lucia, exhausted but smiling, holding a small bundle in her arms. "It's a girl," Lucia whispered, with tears in her eyes. Alexander approached, feeling like the world stopped around him. He looked at the baby, so small, so fragile, and felt something inside him melt. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice breaking with emotion. At that moment, looking at Lucia and the newborn, Alexander understood that his life had changed forever. He was no longer just a businessman, a lonely millionaire. Now he was a protector, a caretaker, maybe a father. "I promise you," she whispered, taking Lucia's hand and gently caressing the baby's cheek, "that I will do everything in my power to protect them and give them the life they deserve." As the sun set outside the hospital window, Alexander Ramos realized that he had found something much more valuable than all the money he had accumulated. A purpose, a reason to live, a family. Night fell on the city, but for Alexander, Lucia, and the little newborn, it was the dawn of a new life, full of challenges, but also love and hope. The weeks after the baby's birth were a whirlwind of emotions and discoveries for Alexander. While he adapted to his new role as protector, the investigation into Lucia's past continued in secret. One afternoon, as Alexander gently rocked the little girl in his arms, his private detective, Javier, hurried into the room. "Mr. Ramos," Javier said, his voice strained, "we've discovered something. Something big." Alexander looked at the sleeping baby and then at Javier. "Speak," he ordered quietly. Javier took out a folder. "Lucia's mother, Laura, is alive, and she is in danger." Alexander's heart skipped a beat. "Laura? But I thought—" "He's been on the run," Javier continued. "It seems she became embroiled in a web of corruption involving some of the most powerful people in the city. People you know, sir." Alexander felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Who is it?" Javier gave him a list of names. Alexander read it, his face paling with each name. "It can't be," he murmured. "These are my partners, my friends, and your enemies, sir," Javier added. "Laura discovered something that could destroy them. That's why they're chasing her. That's why Lucia ended up at their door." Alexander looked at the baby in his arms, then towards the room where Lucia was resting. A cold fury began to grow inside him. "Where is Laura now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "We don't know for sure, but we have a lead. A place on the outskirts of the city." Alexander stood up, gently placing the baby in her crib. "Get the car ready. Let's go look for her." As they headed towards the location, Alexander felt like he was entering a world he had tried to stay away from for years. A world of betrayals, revenge, and mortal dangers. They arrived at an old abandoned warehouse. Alexander got out of the car, his heart pounding. "Laura," he shouted, his voice echoing in the empty space. A movement in the shadows. A figure slowly emerged. "Alexander," a weak voice responded, and there she was, Laura, emaciated, scared, but alive. "Laura," Alexander whispered, moving closer. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand." Tears ran down Laura's face. "Alexander, they have to know. The corruption, the murders. It goes beyond what you can imagine." Before Alexander could respond, the sound of approaching cars filled the air. "They found us," Laura said, fear evident in her voice. Alexander took her arm. "Come on. I'll get you out of here. I'll protect you and Lucia. Promise." As they ran to the car, Alexander knew he was about to face the darkest forces in his world. But for the first time in his life, he had something truly worth fighting for. The night loomed over them, full of dangers and secrets to reveal. But Alexander Ramos was ready to face them all. For the family he never knew he needed. The following days became a whirlwind of action and danger. Alexander, Laura, and the girls took refuge in a safe house on the outskirts of the city. The millionaire had mobilized all his resources to protect them, but he knew that it was only a matter of time before his enemies found them. One night, while Laura slept with the girls, Alexander was in the improvised study, reviewing documents and evidence. The weight of the truth overwhelmed him. "How could I be so blind?" he muttered to himself, running his hands through his gray hair. Suddenly, a noise at the window alerted him. He jumped up, heart pounding. Cautiously, he approached and drew the curtain. Outside in the darkness, he saw a shadow move. Without a second thought, he opened the back door and stepped out, armed only with his determination. "I know you're there," he said out loud. "Show yourself." A familiar figure emerged from the shadows. It was Carlos, his former partner and friend. "Alexander," Carlos said, his voice cold. "I knew we would find them eventually." Alexander stood his ground. "Why, Carlos? Why all this?" Carlos let out a bitter laugh. "Why? For power, for money. The same thing that has always motivated us, old friend. But you have become weak." "No," Alexander responded, his voice thick with emotion. "I have found something stronger than power and money. I have found a reason to live." Carlos pulled out a gun. "What a shame. We could have remained partners." At that moment, Laura appeared at the door. "Alexander, be careful." Everything happened in an instant. Carlos pointed his gun at Laura. Alexander, moved by an instinct he didn't know he had, lunged toward her. The shot echoed into the night. Alexander fell to the ground, feeling a sharp pain in his shoulder. Laura screamed, running towards him. "Alexander, no!" But the millionaire did not give up. With a superhuman effort, he stood up, facing Carlos. "It's over," he said, his voice firm despite the pain. "I have all the evidence. The police are on the way. Everything will come to light." Carlos, seeing that he was cornered, lowered his gun slowly. In the distance, sirens could be heard approaching. As the police arrived and arrested Carlos, Alexander turned to Laura, hugging her tightly. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't protect you before. But now, I promise you, nothing and no one will hurt you again." Laura looked at him, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, Alexander, for everything." That night, as paramedics treated his wound and police took statements, Alexander knew his life had changed forever. He was no longer the cold, calculating businessman. He was a protector, a father, a man willing to sacrifice everything for his family. Looking towards the house, where Lucia and the baby were waiting, Alexander felt a peace he had never experienced before. The road ahead would be difficult, full of legal and personal challenges, but he was ready to face them all. The night gave way to dawn, and with it, the promise of a new beginning for Alexander and his newly formed family. The months passed, and Alexander Ramos's life underwent a radical transformation. The trial against his former associates had taken place, exposing a web of corruption that shook the city's foundations. Alexander, now recovered from his injury, was in the garden of his mansion, watching Lucia play with her little daughter. "What are you thinking?" a soft voice asked next to him. It was Clara, the social worker who had been helping the family throughout the process. Alexander smiled, a gesture that had become more frequent recently. "How much everything has changed. How lucky I am." Clara nodded, her gaze warm. "You've come a long way, Alexander. You've built a beautiful family." At this moment, Laura walked over, holding a tray with soft drinks. "Anyone want lemonade?" The three of them sat on the terrace, watching Lucia and little Sofia. The air was filled with laughter and joy, a sound that was once strange in the Ramos mansion. "I never thought I'd have this," Alexander confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "A family, a home full of love." Laura took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You saved us, Alexander. You gave us a new life." "No," he replied, looking into her eyes. "You saved me. You taught me the true meaning of life, of love." Clara watched them, a smile on her face. "And what's next for the Ramos family?" Alexander looked towards the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set. "Now we build our future. Together." He stood up, walking towards Lucia and Sofia. He knelt next to them, joining in their game. Laughter filled the air, a sound that made Alexander's heart swell with happiness. Laura and Clara joined them, and soon, the garden was filled with joy and warmth. Alexander looked around him, at the people who now made up his world, and felt overwhelming gratitude. That night, as he put Sophia to bed, the little girl looked at him with her big innocent eyes. "I love you, Grandpa," she whispered, before falling asleep. Alexander felt tears fill his eyes. "And I love you, my little one," he replied, gently kissing her forehead. He left the room and met Laura in the hallway. Without saying a word, they embraced each other, sharing a moment of silent understanding and love. "Who would have thought?" Laura murmured. "The cold businessman, now the heart of this family." Alexander smiled, looking towards Sophia's room. Life has mysterious ways of giving us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it. Together, they walked to the terrace, where Clara was waiting for them with a bottle of wine. The three of them sat, watching the stars beginning to appear in the night sky. To the family, Alexander toasted, raising his glass. For second chances and for the love that changes everything. As glasses clinked, Alexander Ramos knew he had found his true wealth. Not in bank accounts or property, but in the hearts of the people around him. The lonely millionaire had disappeared, and in his place, a new man had been born. A father, a grandfather, a protector. The night progressed, and with it, the promise of a tomorrow full of love, laughter, and the warmth of a family that had been born from the most unexpected circumstances. Alexander Ramos had finally found his home.